much better. My name is Jalitz Villegas. I am the Forced Marriage Initiative Manager. My deepest gratitude to the Office of Violence Against Women for funding this webinar and for all of you for being here today. We are thrilled to share the have over the last 10 years, and just very excited to be here with you all and also to learn from you. So let's get started. Okay. And so who who are we and where are we coming from? The Forced Marriage Initiative is a program at the Tahirih Justice Center. Tahirih is a national organization focused on serving immigrant survivors of gender-based violence. And we do this via our interdisciplinary model, where we combine free legal services and social services case management. We are focused in providing legal and social services, and we do this in California, Texas, Georgia, and our regional office covers Virginia, DC, and Maryland. The Forced Marriage Initiative is housed in the regional office, but our services are national. I'm going to pass it to Casey to share a bit more about the history of the forced marriage and why we are facilitating this webinar. Again, with gratitude to all of you for being here. And Casey, I'm passing it to you now.
Thank you so much, Jalitz. And again, thank you to OVW for your support of this incredible work that Jalitz is leading. I am here and I will show my age a little bit in the next couple of slides, but I have been at the Tahirih Justice Center in different positions on the Forced Marriage Initiative since 2013. The Forced Marriage Initiative, though, even predates my time at Tahirih and was established in 2011. We started the Forced Marriage Initiative at the Tahirih Justice Center after we realized how little was known about the fact that forced marriage was happening across communities in the United States and how many survivors were falling through the cracks of the systems that are set up to allow individuals at risk of harm or currently experiencing gender-based harm to get safe. And so in 2011, we did a national survey, and out of that national survey came a lot of the baseline data and information that informed the foundation of this program and its growth over time. A big piece of the work that we've done over the years is to translate the direct services work that we do into policy change. We launched the campaign to end child marriage, given how vulnerable children under the age of 18 are to the threat of forced marriage. That was back in 2016. Since then, 35 states in total have taken some action to limit or end child marriage. And the bread and butter, really, of what the Forced Marriage Initiative is doing beyond our direct services is working to mainstream this form of harm across the movement so that every advocate working on domestic and sexual violence and with survivors has the resources and the practical tools that they need to be able to identify cases and appropriately support them. And so I've mentioned the direct services. I just want to make sure folks know that that is a part of the program that we offer. We also coordinate a national forced marriage working group, which is a really unique group of organizations that are working at the community level, organizations like Tahirih, and organizations that are very national, all coming together on a bi-monthly basis to talk specifically about trends that they are seeing with forced marriage survivors that are coming to them for support and potential policy solutions on the state or federal level. Tahirih is also one of the three co-chairs of Girls Not Brides USA, a space that is bringing together advocates that work globally to end child marriage and domestically to end child marriage and bridging the gap between those two movements. And one of our big successes happened most recently, where in 2022, during the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, we got what looks like a very small amount of text written into what is a very big piece of legislation. But it meant that for the very first time, forced marriage was defined as a form of harm that is happening in the United States and that often intersects with sexual violence, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. And that has meant the world to survivors to see themselves reflected in that foundational document. And it has meant the world to advocates to see that recognition and to be able to be a part of this more mainstream work and bring this issue to the attention of advocates who most certainly have survivors of forced marriage in their caseloads, and to be able to provide the training, technical assistance, and resources that folks need so any survivor anywhere in the country can call their local agency and get the help that they need. And of course, last year, we officially became an Office on Violence Against Women training and technical assistance provider, which is such a huge deal for us. And I'm so excited to see the way that Halitz has led this work in partnership with Brianna and the other members of our team. And it has been one of the joys of my life to pass the baton of that program. And with that, we will take it to the next slide, where I will pass it off to our other amazing colleague. So the first thing that we did, with incredible guidance from our program officer and other units across the Office on Violence Against Women, was a field assessment, asking other victim services providers what was their level of familiarity with forced marriage, whether they had a working definition, how they could or could not serve survivors of forced marriage. And Alex is going to walk us through some of the key findings from that field assessment.
Thank you, Casey. And thanks, first of all, to everyone who completed that field assessment. As Casey mentioned, one of the key pieces of this project was to start by evaluating what is it that victim service providers across the United States know about forced marriage and what is it that they don't know. And so in order to do that, we launched a field assessment to gauge that familiarity with forced marriage. We met with several OVW units to ensure the questions would resonate with recipients, and then we sent the survey out to victim service providers across the country, including OVW grantees and potential grantees. And so I'd love to quick poll now, just asking yes or no, did you participate in this field assessment? Is that what brought you here today? Or is this a new project for you?
Thank you, Alex. If folks could answer in the chat, that would be great.
Okay, I'm seeing in chat a lot of no's. Folks did not participate in the field assessment or didn't receive it, which is exciting that this is a somewhat new audience. And so as I go through the results of what we found in the assessment, it'd be great to have everyone kind of reflect on whether what we found in the assessment feels true for you, or if there are key places where maybe you feel like you know a little bit more or a little bit less about this issue and how to provide services than the respondents to the assessment itself. So we got responses from 239 victim services providers across the country, and we were really excited to see the wide range of perspectives that was represented in those responses. We heard from folks who are providing legal services, providing services to survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, folks working in transitional housing and shelter environments, medical and mental health services, community service providers, law enforcement, and a lot of other perspectives that I didn't have space on the slide to list here. The good news, what we found in the assessment, is that 84% of respondents said that they were familiar with forced or coerced marriage, at least as a concept. And that is really affirming for us who specialize in this issue. We've been working on the issue, as Casey mentioned, since 2011. And a lot of that work has been that awareness raising. And so seeing that we are starting to make an impact and that folks are aware of this issue is really exciting. On the other hand, we found that there is still a significant need for training among victim services providers. One of the themes that came up in the responses was that agencies' processes are not generally accounting for forced marriage as a type of harm. We saw that only 4% of respondents said that their agency has a working definition of forced marriage, and only 9% of respondents said that their agency clearly communicates that they can provide services to people who are facing a forced marriage. A large majority, 78%, said that they don't trust their own screening processes or intake processes to be able to identify forced marriage cases within their existing caseloads. And so that, of course, is really concerning. We also found that many service providers don't feel equipped to work on these cases when they do come up. 23% said that they had never been trained on how forced marriage intersects with other forms of harm, and only 24% were aware of any state laws addressing this issue. We also found that many victim service providers feel unclear when it comes to their ability to provide services. 25% said that they were unsure whether their agency could provide services for survivors of forced marriage who are not experiencing domestic violence or sexual assault. 58%, so a majority, were unsure about whether protection orders were available to people in this situation. And 21% were unsure whether they are able to provide services to married minors, even those who are facing domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking. And with that, I will pass back to my colleague Halitz to talk a little bit more about forced marriage as an issue.
Halitz, I might jump in really quickly before we dive into the full sort of part of this presentation, just to give folks a quick note on terminology.
Perfect. Thank you, Casey.
So we know that all of us use the term gender-based violence a lot. I have gotten into the habit of referring to it as GBV as shorthand, which I think does a bit of a disservice to the subject that we're talking about. So we wanted to take a moment to slow down a little bit today and make sure that we are all grounded in the definition of gender-based violence as Tahirih refers to it, and as many other organizations refer to it as well. But gender-based violence refers to harmful acts directed at an individual or a group of individuals based on their gender. It is rooted in gender inequality, the abuse of power and amplifying harmful norms, And while women and girls experience GBV disproportionately, people who identify as any gender at any point on the gender spectrum can also be targeted with gender-based violence. I also want to be clear that we are going to use a lot of gendered language today. The unfortunate truth is that forced marriage can affect anyone, but it is a gendered social problem, with women and girls being disproportionately targeted and harmed. For that reason, survivors or those at risk may be referred to as women and girls or she or her throughout this presentation. This is not meant to minimize the experience of men, boys, or gender non-binary, non-conforming individuals. And there are some statistics on the left of this slide from our own casework that really show the gendered nature of this harm. Our program openly serves survivors of all genders, and yet we see that approximately 95% of the individuals we have served identify as female. 5% have identified as trans, non-binary, or another identity. And with that, I will pass it off to our colleague, Brianna.
Thank you, Casey. Hello, everyone. My name is Brianna Roberts, and I am the Forced Marriage Initiative Associate. In my role, I directly support the clients that we serve, and I also assist with the training needs. So it's so wonderful to be here with everyone today. To get us started, we're going to be reviewing the definitions that ground us in the work that we do at Tahirih. Forced marriage is defined as a marriage where one or both people do not or cannot consent to the marriage and typically involves elements of force, fraud, or coercion. At Tahirih, we do not equate forced marriage to an arranged marriage process. An arranged marriage is one where families may take the lead, but the ultimate choice to marry remains with that individual. As service providers, it's important for you to understand these definitions and the different terms used to help guide the way that you ask questions if you suspect someone is facing a forced marriage or they've been forced to marry. The reason why this is important is so that you understand that this is a form of abuse that could also be happening alongside other forms of abuse. Survivors are likely won't disclose that they are facing a forced marriage. So we want to ensure that you have the resources and tools to provide services to this population. But we also must recognize and allow space for survivors to name their situation, understanding that they might use different terminology to define what they're going through. And that is okay, and it speaks to the nuance of this issue. But overall, as service providers, regardless of the terminology used, what you are assessing for is if consent is present in the marriage process. Consenting to a marriage is not as straightforward as some people might think. There are several different aspects of the marriage process that an individual is consenting to. And it's not just the marriage itself. This could include the timing and the person. This next graphic was provided to us by Vidya Suri, who is a survivor advocate attending Harvard, and Dirakshan Raja, who was at the Urban Institute at the time. This graphic helps us understand how an arranged marriage can turn into a forced marriage. Um, Arranged marriage and forced marriage exists on a spectrum where consent and the ability to ask questions or have preferences or change one's mind or reject the proposal altogether are critical factors. An arranged marriage may start with the individual having full participation in the spouse selection process, but over time, the family may begin to disregard the individual's questions or concerns. They might dismiss the individual's preference entirely. This then moves the person into a situation where they are facing a forced marriage. But it's important to keep in mind that these changes do not occur in a linear way. Forced marriages do have the tendency to escalate pretty quickly. An individual who's at risk of a forced marriage may, start out at stage one, where the family is suggesting the need for a marriage. And then due to the individual family triggers, the process might escalate to the stage 8, where they're being forced to marry. And to ensure that it's clear for all, when we are talking about consent in the process, we mean at all levels. So consent here is not just about the individual they're marrying, but also considers the timing, the idea of getting married, and consent should be across the board. So it's yes to the idea of marriage, it's yes to the timing, the person, and that they have the ability to express their wishes without negative consequences or fear of harm for themselves or for somebody else. Next, I want to pass it to Halitz to expand more on this topic of consent.
Thank you so much, Brianna. And so, as Brianna shared in the marriage process, we're looking at consent at all levels, and lack of consent can be caused by several reasons. And so, the individuals who are in that marriage process, perhaps they may be younger than the legal age to marry. As the definition of forced marriage names, they may be subject to force, to fraud, or coercion, or they could also be subject to some incapacity or disability. And some common examples used to force or coerce someone to comply are, family members, parents in particular, stating that they will end their own life if the marriage does not happen, right? Being told that if marriage does not happen, that the family will cut that child, whether they are, a minor or an adult, they will cut them off financially, right? They will not have housing. They will not pay for their education. They will take their vehicle away, their cell phone, their devices, even anything that's connected to their education to get them to comply. We've also seen cases where partners or other abusers threaten to share explicit pictures if they do not agree to remain in the relationship or if they do not agree to the marriage demands. And sadly, it is not uncommon for us to learn of individuals who have signed documents that they do not understand, and then they find themselves, surprised to actually be legally married. And that could be for various reasons, whether they may have an intellectual disability or perhaps they just are signing documents that are in a different language. We have also seen parents or guardians not wanting the quote unquote burden of care for a child who has an intellectual or developmental disability, and at times have even seen individuals be drugged or forced to drink to the level of drunkenness that they have no idea how they signed documents or how they ended up married, to begin with. You know, And just to expand on terminology a little bit, because Casey and Brianna shared the importance of terminology, and I want to be clear that we do not equate arranged marriage with forced marriage. The graphic that was previously used is to give us a visual of how an arranged marriage process may become a forced marriage. But again, that does not always happen, but important to understand the terminology, as a survivor or someone at risk may call their process or their situation arranged. But again, we're listening as service providers for that free and full consent throughout the entire process. And so it is important for service providers to understand this terminology, right? We recognize that the language that we use when we talk about issues of gender-based violence, it can cause harm and leave people feeling excluded from services. And that also means excluded from safety and the resources that they deserve. As my colleague Alex shared earlier, only 9% of respondents to our field assessment named that their organization clearly stated that they provided services to individuals facing forced marriage. So to ensure that forced marriage survivors and those at risk receive the quality services that they deserve, we must enhance our own understanding of this issue, but then clearly name that forced marriage survivors or those at risk are able to receive our services or are able to be served by our agencies. We recognize that a core part of trauma-informed practices is allowing for people to have a choice and power over how they name their experiences. While we also recognize that in situations of forced marriage, there is a level of normalized, repeated cycles of violence that could impact someone who is at risk from even recognizing that the conditions upon which they may have been married was abusive. And so again, it is up to us to understand these issues and to think about how we can enhance our own practices so that we can support individuals at risk. And to just deep dive a little bit further on the marriages that we may be discussing today, it's not just about marriages that are going to happen. It's about marriages altogether, right? And so forced marriage may have already happened, regardless of how long ago, regardless, if there was a piece of consent in the process, right? But not all the levels of the marriage process, right? Again, that consent is key. So regardless of how long someone may have been married, understanding the onset of that relationship is critical, right? We know that the dynamics in relationships shift over time, and a marriage could certainly start as a love or chosen marriage, but then abuse may follow, right? And force, fraud, coercion, or other tactics could be used to force a person to remain in the marriage. And lastly, folks of all ages can be impacted. And we know that those under the legal age of majority face extreme challenges in the help-seeking process, with authorities often referring to parent or delegating or trusting parents, often naming this as a family or cultural issue, not realizing or respecting that that minor is also a key member of the family and they're also part of their culture. And if they are naming a process that is harmful to them, they should be supported. And so to expand a bit more on child marriage, because we cannot speak about the issue of forced marriage without naming the difficulties that folks face when you're working with minors who are facing a forced marriage. The majority of child marriages in the United States do appear to involve several concerning factors. And while we can't say that every child marriage in the United States has been forced, the data is extremely concerning to us. The vast majority of cases involve girls marrying adult men. Some of those men are decades older. Marriage ages are lower in some states than the age of consent. And what is incredibly concerning as someone who has worked directly with survivors of forced marriage, who knows that families and parents are often perpetrators, we also know of states where parental consent exceptions can certainly enable parental coercion. And before I move ahead, I'd like to read a quote from a survivor, which I think just drives this point a bit more powerful. This survivor stated, "That little girl was me, and my perfect soccer mom did not look like an abuser. No one saw her for what she was, and no one helped me." And so during this training, we are not going to deep dive further on child marriage, but we hope that those of you who are attending today will join us for our post-webinar reflection call on Monday the 30th. And we're happy to discuss this particular issue further. And my colleague Alex will be dropping in the chat, if he has not done so already, more information on child marriage that we have worked on. Rihanna, would you like to ask this question?
Yes. Hello, everyone. So feel free to drop your answers in the chat. But to get us started, when you think about forced marriage, what forms of abuse, illegal acts, or potential crimes come to mind? So some answers in the chat are false imprisonment, domestic servitude, sexual abuse, isolation. I see labor trafficking, statutory rape. There's some domestic violence and isolation, forced pregnancy. Financial and credit exploitation. We do see that often in some of our cases. Religious abuse, servile marriage. Yeah, these are all some great examples of, abuse that we often see in the cases that we work on.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to those of you who participated in the chat. It's wonderful to see that so many of you recognize that there is a connection with forced marriage and other forms of abuse, which we'll talk more about in just a little bit. But Rhea, I love it if you could continue to share a bit more about some of the root causes or even the family level triggers that are often present in these cases.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so now that we went over the definitions of forced marriage and consent, some people might wonder why forced marriage exists in the first place. This graphic provides a great overview of why forced marriage happens. The reasons are quite complex and they are varied depending on the individual's family. Not every case we encounter is the same, even if they're from the same community. Our traditions, our beliefs, values, and societal norms all play a role in deciding what is tolerated in one household versus what's prohibited in another. Sometimes people often also ask, why would a person force someone into a marriage? And that answer as well is complex and it has the motivations are numerous and often intersectional as well. So there is no one reason why forced marriage happens. But what we try to do with this graphic is to illustrate how at the community level and societal level factors that are present across all cultures and communities are just some of the root causes for why forced marriage exists as a tool of power, control, and oppression. And then with that, we relate these root causes to the individual and family level triggers that can be the specific motivation for a forced marriage. There is likely a history of abuse happening before the marriage. The moment of marriage itself is abusive, and the individual can experience abuse within the marriage. It's very different from when, a chosen marriage and that has abuse later on. And this changes the way that we ask questions, we refer to perpetrators, and we conduct our intake and respond to these cases. So as service providers, it's really important that you take the time to assess an individual situation and to better understand what their family dynamics are, to assist the individual to make plans, like safety plans and whatnot. Next, I want to pass it to Halitz to discuss more of the intersections.
And so we recognize and believe that forced marriage is a form of violence against women, against girls on its own. When you think about a woman or girl feeling that they have no real choice when it comes to marriage, we know that she loses a great deal of power and control over her own life. What we also recognize and know from the work that we have been doing for over the last 11 years is that forced marriage is never happening by itself. So the abuse of forced marriage is often happening alongside other forms of violence. When you think about someone losing a choice when it comes to marriage, you have to think about what that fully entails. That person loses control, as I mentioned, of their own life. It's also loss of control of their body, um, often of their education, of their career. Now that spouse or the family that is driving the process forward is controlling where you live. Often you also lose the control of whether you even have children or how many you have, and at times even that access to appropriate health care. But it is not typically the problem that service providers are first noticing, right? And so, as service providers for the Forced Marriage Initiative, it is common for us to be directly contacted by individuals at risk of forced marriage because the name of our program, right? Our website is preventforcedmarriage.org. Our team, right, is the FMI, the Forced Marriage Initiative, right? And so it is clear for folks that if they're contacting us, the type of support that they can expect. It is often not the case for other service providers, right? When you think about domestic violence, sexual assault, uh, you know, um, dating violence, or even stalking related programming, often those of you who work in or at those centers are in contact with folks because of those forms of abuse, right? And so forced marriage tends to be hidden or be um, a a form of abuse or trauma that is not the presenting problem. And again, this speaks to the need of service providers to understand this issue and to understand how important asking the right questions at time of screening, at time of assessment, so that we are truly able to identify this full trauma history and serve survivors in the holistic way that they deserve. More often than not, forced marriage is part of a spectrum of other harms that a woman or a girl who is being forced to marry will face in her lifetime. Likely, that woman or girl has experienced abuse and or violence prior to the marriage as part um, of the process to get her to comply to the marriage, to comply to those demands, and to let her know how severe the consequences will be if they refuse, if they say no, if they attempt to seek any sort of help. Often we forget that that marriage itself is an act of violence. That is a union that is legally binding, that is moving forward without full and free consent. And while I can't say that every single woman or girl who is forced to marry will experience violence in her marriage, sadly, the majority of cases that we have handled do include that forced partner then becoming an intimate partner who is also violent. The marriage, again, just involves and implies a tremendous power imbalance, right? So even if we don't see domestic violence or physical violence in that marriage, again, the union itself tragically is just imbalance. And so let's dive a little bit deeper into how these cases can appear. Yeah. So we recognize, we know that domestic violence can be, physical, sexual, emotional, economic, or even psychological actions or threats. The forms of abuse, intimidation, blame, and the pressure that are employed against victims of forced marriage are often indistinguishable from the forms of abuse and control that are utilized by perpetrators in domestic and family violence contexts. What complicates these cases, amongst many things, is that in these cases, we see a wide web of perpetrators, right? So it's not just that intimate partner who may be abusive. Yes, that is a potential perpetrator, but we're also talking about your immediate family, extended family, community members, and at times even religious leaders who are often involved in pressuring an individual to marry or pressuring them to remain in an abusive marriage or a marriage they never wanted to be in the first place. What also complicates these cases is that often the actions of those individuals are not covered by state domestic violence or family violence laws, including the typical protection order statutes. If the person or persons are not closely related to the victim, or they do not currently live or have never lived with the victim, it can be incredibly difficult to identify civil remedies. And often the individual at risk can't do this on their own. They need a trained advocate, a trained legal professional to help them identify what those avenues of support look like. The American Bar Association, condemns forced marriage as a fundamental human rights violation and a form of violence against. This is a form of family perpetrated abuse that happens or can happen before marriage even takes place to again force or coerce someone to comply to those marriage demands. The intimate partner may also be abusive, while at the same time, the family may be abusive to get the survivor to remain in the marriage or to minimize that intimate partner violence. So again, we're talking about abuse at multiple levels at various times. And if it is confusing to you, then I ask you to think about how confusing it is for a survivor or someone at risk who may call your organization or may walk into your center and does not have this advocate language to explain their situation. Now, stalking in these cases can be defined by the typical patterns or repeated unwanted attention that all of us are probably familiar with. But the uniqueness in these types of cases is that familial component, where those who are closest to the individual at risk use that natural proximity to report back to perpetrators, right? And of course, there is easier access to information if your perpetrator, who is often your family or parents, are the account holders or the account managers for devices such as laptops or cell phones or emails or even a shared iCloud. I'd like to read this quote from a survivor that speaks to the use of that natural proximity in this type of work. This survivor stated, "At work, my sister-in-law would inform my husband anytime she thought I had misbehaved. I learned to avoid eye contact, staring at the ground while quietly asking for orders, so that my husband would not hear that I had been flirting with customers." Moving into the intersection with dating violence. Dating violence, in brief, is defined by violence committed by a person who is or has been in a social relationship of a romantic or intimate nature with the victim. Dynamics in a relationship, as we have stated, can shift over time. A relationship that once was a loving or chosen relationship may turn violent. The partners regard can be regardless of their age, coercive. They can use manipulation, intimidation, and use whatever knowledge they have about the individual at risk that has been shared with them to potentially uh, manipulate that person to stay in that abusive relationship, or perhaps they will report to their family or to their community, or utilize uh, anything that person may have told them that they know could get them in trouble, right? And so that is a way that we have seen these, loving or chosen relationships utilize abusive tactics to then force a woman or girl to remain in an abusive, dating relationship, and even to then enter into marriage. I think we all recognize the seriousness of child abuse and the impact that child abuse has on someone's health and their overall well-being. Unfortunately, often when children or minors, youth, are facing the threat of a forced marriage, or when they disclose, those in a position to help do not understand the seriousness of this threat, or why their fear uh, is real. Often, when working with minors, expert guidance is needed to assist in the framing of questions and to further explore the tactics that are being used to get a child to comply, or to better understand why they fear a future forced marriage, which I think is a very powerful position to be in when you think about how rare it is for those of us who are in the movement to end gender-based violence to know when a future harm is going to happen. And so when a child comes forward fearing something that's going to happen in the future, it is a unique moment of prevention. That said, state child abuse laws and response protocols may not be fully equipped to handle that future moment of abuse, that future fear. Often protocols are focused primarily on physical injury, current, severe injury, and they may not encompass the full range of coercive tactics and threats, the emotional abuse that is common in these cases. We often see that for child abuse laws and protocols, they often require a level of imminence of harm or a direct causation between that emotional abuse that results in a psychological disorder. And that is just incredibly hard for anyone to prove, even harder for a minor to prove. Often they just want help and they just want the abuse to stop and are very worried about their family. You know, just to continue to discuss more on child abuse, I think if you pause to think about, the level of authority that family and parents specifically have over children, it can help us to think about why it may be difficult for someone to even um, question or to even recognize that they are in a situation that is harmful, right? So, family can often tell you, what to wear, what you eat, what religion you are, where you worship. But to think that, marriage is truly your choice, that's really difficult to comprehend. And so, minors, youth, they are unaware of their rights, of their options, and there is a lack of understanding what consent is, especially in this process. Some survivors have also named almost a grooming process when they think back about the family dynamics and the expectations, which can be a bit different from the typical use of the definition of grooming. And so I like to read over this survivor quote, which I think drives that point a little bit deeper. The survivor stated, "He began grooming me and making me feel ways I had never been able to feel before. I felt beautiful with him, like I really mattered to someone, finally. Shortly after we married, he made no secret of his expectations for my wifely duties, which were incredibly exploitive." I think this quote goes hand in hand with the typical definition around grooming, which again can be found in forced child marriage dynamics, right? So it is, these terms, this information, I believe, it is incredibly complex. And at the same time, when you pause and think about your knowledge, the services that you are already providing, I don't think it is that difficult to be able to dive a little bit deeper to ask and be able to recognize and identify if you are working with someone who is also at risk of forced marriage or who may have been forced to marry. I think it follows that a non-consensual marriage will lead to rape and sexual assault, given the expectations of marriage. Often this, when someone is calling for help, they may not think to name that future fear of sexual assault. And if you are working at a center that is able to provide services to survivors who have, faced some sort of intimate partner violence, I ask you to think about how this connection between rape and sexual assault in forced marriage cases could potentially open the doors to your services to those survivors who are in that moment of prevention. What we have also seen when it comes to rape and sexual assault is that it can be a consequence, unfortunately, to force a woman or a girl to marry. We know of families that name, again, quoting, protecting their daughter's marriageability or the marriageability of a sibling after someone has been sexually assaulted, wanting to marry, off that victim before anyone else finds out of that rape or sexual assault, and even blaming the victim, using marriage to protect that predator, to shield that perpetrator from any sort of legal repercussions. I like to read this quote from a survivor that was included in their testimony letter as part of their advocacy. The survivor stated, "I did not want to marry him, but felt pressured into doing so, in part through conversations with my parents, but largely due to our conservative religious beliefs that made me feel that I was damaged and unlovable due to the abuse that I had already endured." And so before I move ahead from this section, it's I would not do this issue justice if I did not cover these two types of harm, which are female genital mutilation or cutting and human trafficking. Uh, in brief, if you are screening for female genital mutilation or cutting, you should also be screening for forced marriage. Often, female genital cutting can be a precursor to marriage. Um, it can also, be done in preparation for someone to be, marriageable. I know that the Office of Violence Against Women is funding a project in partnership with George Washington University, Global Women Peace Foundation, and SEIO on female genital mutilation and cutting. And I look forward to learning more and discussing the intersection with forced marriage. I noticed earlier when Brianna asked about the types of crime or repercussions that folks may think about when it comes to, forced marriage. A lot of folks did name trafficking, and certainly there are some cases that involve elements of human trafficking, especially when we are looking at that forced labor. There are some cases that certainly have these dynamics. Um, you know, if the driving motivation for the family is financial, or to settle a debt, we may be seeing some trafficking dynamics. We have also seen cases of individuals being forced to marry their traffickers, or marriage being used as that tool to traffic a woman or girl. But for the purposes of this webinar, the focus is truly on the intersection with domestic and family violence, right? With dating violence, with stalking, and of course with rape and sexual assault, so that if anyone is reaching out for your services, that you're able to better spot these individuals. And frankly, you likely have them in your caseload already and may not even know it. Bree, would you mind coming back on to share a bit about the coercive tactics that are often present?
Yes, thank you. So I actually come from an anti-trafficking background, and I used to work for an anti-trafficking organization. And while there, it never really occurred to me to ask victims or survivors who are reaching out if they were forced to marry or if they were facing a forced marriage. So, like many on this call today, we had in-depth intake assessment questions to better understand who exactly the perpetrators were. And as service providers, you might find these tactics quite familiar to get a survivor to comply with abusive demands. However, these tactics that are used in forced marriage cases may show up in ways that you have not considered or just a little bit differently. To highlight a few, I want to first start with emotional blackmail. You might be familiar with this, but this, takes a great toll on the individuals that we serve. Survivors and individuals at risk, they often feel like they are responsible for hurting the family. Sometimes they're being blamed for ruining their family's reputation, their younger siblings' chances to get married. And this type of emotional manipulation takes a great toll on their emotional and their mental well-being. For economic threats, I'm sure that you might have a good understanding of how financial abuse might show up in your casework, but for forced marriage cases, the the perpetrators are often using the natural responsibilities that they have within that relationship. So think of they're the head of household, or they're the parent. And they use that responsibility to further control a person. So the perpetrators might be not providing their tax information to give to individuals while they're applying for financial aid for college. They might be the ones who are setting up a joint bank account because, they're a minor and they have, access to the family phone plans because they're the account holder. So just everyday life, this is something that is considered normal for parents to do. But in forced marriage cases, this just increases the control and the monitoring and exerting their abusive demands. For deception, Halit's mentioned this already, but signing marriage documents in languages that you don't understand, but now are legally binding. And then, for immigration-related threats, this is not just for individuals who are here on an immigration status, but this is across the board. It includes individuals that have U.S. citizenship as well. So similar to economic threats, often individuals are not, individuals at risk are not in that decision-making process to migrate to another country. They're not controlling their identity documents. So they might be threatened with, threats of deportation, or they're getting sent back to their home country, the family's home country, and they do not have knowledge, or they might be unaware of what their rights are. So this is a very scary tactic that is being used against them. The impacts of the coercive tactics takes a toll, an extreme toll on individuals. And, at times it makes it very difficult for them to seek help or to take action. I want to get into case dynamics. Often survivors, they want to stay connected with the individuals, stay connected with their families, and they just simply want the abuse to stop. So starting the process to avoid a forced marriage or to leave a marriage that they've been forced into is a very big decision that does not come lightly for the individuals that we serve. Many survivors are considering the various consequences that could harm themselves, friends, other family members. So this leads to decision paralysis sometimes, and each family's reaction might be different. And we often see that the various options that are being discussed to them or trying to anticipate their reaction can be very overwhelming at times. And there's a lot to consider, like the fear of, social ostracism, the lack of community support or financial support, and, fears of other, families members or pets within the household. And this could lead to them having second thoughts. And then, service providers, sometimes we are not asking about the additional consequences, and sometimes we're missing the opportunity to explore the perceptions of risk an individual has about their, own situation. So it's important to follow up. And then just lastly, for the threats and pressures from many sources, people who are impacted by this form of harm are facing pressures from outside sources in addition to their immediate family. So this could look like extended family members, like aunts and uncles, or this can even be community members who are maybe pressuring the parents to kind of pressure the individual to get married. So it's just important to be mindful that they might not have a large support system because they're facing pressures from different social connections. I know for myself in my previous role, it was really common for me to ask if they had other supportive families, well, not just families, but also, like friends, community members that they can lean on. But unfortunately, for some forced marriage cases, it just might be unsafe for them to share with anyone that they are seeking support. Um, and
Thank
then,
you.
mhm,
Thank you, Brie. I think that was a really great segue to the next piece. And so, as we think about these case dynamics and what you've shared about the coercive tactics that are often present, which are tactics, excuse me, often found across um, forms of violence against women and girls, but again, uh, often being missed by service providers because we're not asking at time of intake, at time of assessment. We are not asking about this type of harm, right? Or about the conditions upon um, which someone may have been married under. And so I'm going to pause for a minute because I'd love to give folks time to maybe process a little bit about what we have recently shared regarding the intersection of forced marriage and other forms of abuse, those coercive tactics and case dynamics that Brianna shared. And I'm wondering, now that you have this information, when you think about your organization's intake, when you think about your own assessment protocols, are there any forms that you use to determine eligibility of services that perhaps could be enhanced to ensure survivors who are facing or who could be facing or at risk of forced marriage for them to also be identified? Is that something that you think is possible? I love for folks to use the chat. I think as folks think about their own intake, their own assessment protocols, I love to know if folks also think no and why that would be, because that would certainly support, um, our program in figuring out ways to make those processes easier for you as, a technical assistance provider, right? For us to be able to support you all in being able to screen for this type of harm alongside the forms of abuse that you already provide services to. When I first started my career, I worked at a domestic violence center and I asked hundreds and hundreds of individuals about, their relationship status. I was working at a domestic violence center, and so, clearly they were in a relationship. That relationship was abusive. It wasn't until I started working at Tahirih that it dawned on me that I never assumed, that I always assumed that the relationship that, they were coming to our program for, was consensual. It never, I never thought to ask about the onset of that relationship. And when I think back, I do believe that I've missed cases that perhaps had, um, you know, a forced marriage, intimate partner violence, family violence dynamic, maybe even trafficking dynamics that I just never asked about because my own intake assessment process did not include that information. And so as I move ahead, I want to give thanks to one of our project partners, Daya in Houston, who shared with us their helpline intake, which is the image that is on, the right of this slide. And they do ask about forced marriage at time of intake and assessment. Dr. Nusrat Amin shared with us, this quote. So, naming that before, they did not keep track of forced marriage as a separate victimization type. Now that we ask about forced marriage, we know we are serving survivors with various needs, multiple perpetrators who may require special attention. And I think that drives the point home for us. We truly believe and know that, survivors of forced marriage are, everywhere. And knowing about the issue, understanding the terminology is one huge part of mainstreaming this issue. Uh, but we also have to take it to the next level, which is asking about the conditions upon, someone's, relationship, right? Thinking again about those intake and assessment protocols. We always ask about relationship status. And I would encourage all of you to think about how that question can be expanded, perhaps utilizing some of the tips on the screen, so that you can explore more about that marriage or that relationship, right? And ideally, if you are asking these questions of all clients, you hopefully will not lean into your own bias and perhaps avoid overlooking in one direction while missing potential individuals who are at risk on the other side, right? Who may not fit the image that you may have in your mind of what a victim of forced marriage looks like. And so my colleagues have, named this throughout. That piece on the perception of risk in these cases is everything. Often we are truly in a moment of, like, again, unique prevention when someone is coming to us knowing that something horrible is going to happen to them, that they know this because of how just marriage happens in their family. They know this because of how it's happened to, their cousins. They know this because family is planning to travel and they've heard about an engagement process, right? It's a truly unique moment to be able to prevent something that, has not happened yet. And we hope that as you think about your own intake, your assessment protocols, the language that you use on your materials, that you think about ways of enhancing those to include asking about forced marriage. And hopefully now you see us as a resource for us to support your service provision, especially in this area, to enhance those protocols. And so as we wrap up, I just want to emphasize the importance of asking about this type of harm, because often we are missing that full trauma history. All of us who are service providers are here because we care. We want to support individuals at risk, survivors, victims, and we are doing them a disservice if we are not asking about this from the very beginning, right? We could identify opportunities for deeper safety planning. We can avoid referring or utilizing abusive networks as part of a safety plan. We can potentially even discover other individuals at risk, right? When you think about this form of abuse being often, family perpetrated type of harm, there are multiple people in a family. And often when one woman, where one girl comes forward and gets the services, that she deserves and gets the help, often she will bring with her siblings, sisters, cousins, right? And truly change the trajectory of that family. And again, I can't emphasize enough how that can be such a powerful and true moment of prevention. And so, we do this work from a non-judgmental point of view. We encourage you to do the same as you think about enhancing your own protocols to include this type of abuse. That taking that trauma-informed approach also means that for these survivors, they may only have one chance to reach out for help. And being turned away is truly life-changing. Be receiving appropriate services can truly mean that, they are able to avoid something horrible happening to them. And again, potentially helping multiple individuals within their family or their community. And so asking the right questions truly can make all the difference. And so I welcome my colleagues, Tahirih, to join me back on screen. And I just want to thank everyone for their time. Again, please see the Forced Marriage Initiative as a resource. We are a technical and training assistance provider. We are happy to review your intake and assessment protocols, to share best practices on this issue, how to better ask questions. We are all working on a framework and tip sheet, sort of speaks for our next webinar, which is an advanced session. It's being held on October 30th. And so we look forward to launching that tool and connecting with you all if you have some tips and guidance on how the tools that we create can be relevant for you, your agency, and those you serve. And lastly, I want to remind folks that we are hosting a post-webinars reflections call on Monday. This is I think, more intimate space with us and those of you who have attended this webinar today to truly be able to deep dive into some of the areas that we may not have covered that you all are interested in, right? And so that could be more related to child marriage. That could be more related to the intersection with, a focus on one of the types of abuse that I named. It could be more related to the laws. I know a lot of you listed wanting more information on laws. So happy to have that time together. And I do hope that you all attend, or some of you attend, and will you also use that time to guide what our advanced webinar should focus on. So I encourage you all to attend. With that, I will be quiet. Casey, is there anything from the chats, from the Q&A, anything at all that we or I may have missed that you'd like to highlight or correct or close us out with?
Nothing certainly to correct. I think there's been just a ton of gratitude in the chat. There is clearly an incredible community of folks who are deeply invested in this, some who brought their own lived expertise and experience to this conversation and this training today. And we're so excited to move forward in this work together. I'm really excited for part 2 and to continue to see this sort of collective work continue. And it's just such a privilege to do it with you and with Bree and with Alex and with everyone who joined us today. And of course, tremendous gratitude to OVW for the funding that makes this possible.
Thank you so much, Casey. I believe my colleagues may have dropped our survey in the chat, our post-webinar survey. So we truly would appreciate if folks complete that. Brianna or Celine, I would appreciate if you could drop that survey in the chat before we close out. and truly hope that folks give us some feedback on, what you like to see from us for our advanced session, also for the materials that we create. Yeah. And so, team, if you could drop that survey link more than once, that would be great. And so I'm not seeing any questions, but again, lots of gratitude to all of you, to our interpreters, to VW, and everyone who was here today. I see one. For Monday, so you're going to actually get a private invite. That is not something that folks can register to. Only those individuals who attended this webinar live will receive that from uh, uh, someone from the team. And so you likely will have that by the end of the day tomorrow. We will have ASL and Spanish language interpretation, and it'll be a more meeting-like atmosphere. And so hoping for more dialogue. So please complete the survey. If there's any specific legal or policy related matters, please include that in the comments. That way we can ensure if we should have other of our legal experts also on the call with us, that would be really helpful to know ahead of time. Yeah. Thank you so much. Again, lots of gratitude to everyone, and I look forward to working with you all and also to providing you the tools that you want and that you need. Thank you all. Have a good one. Gracias a todos.